Beer. Germany drinks 80 million hectoliters a year. That's over 100 liters per person. Large breweries produce vast quantities of beer every year.
We make about 2.2 million hectoliters of beer and beer mixed drinks per year, depending on the season, up to 13 different brews.
Beer is the most complicated beverage in the world. Even though this barley juice has been around for centuries, research is still ongoing.
That's wonderful yeast. I think this beer will be good. We're experimenting a lot here at the moment using wine yeast, for example, so people might ultimately get certain wine aromas in their beer.
Germany is the country with the oldest beer brewing tradition and the largest hop growing area in the world. Young brewers are focused entirely on flavor and quality.
This is brutal. It's perverse.
Hops, green gold. At the Hop Research Center, new strains are being bred for the world market.
These beers are characterized by outstanding drinkability, the unconditional desire for the next drink of beer.
Water, hops, barley, and yeast. Only 4 ingredients, and yet an entire world of variety. Beer. Mönchengladbach. Here is one of the 4 breweries run by the Oettinger Company. North Rhine-Westphalia is Germany's #1 state for beer sales ahead of Bavaria. This location produces 2.2 million hectoliters of beer and beer mixed drinks annually. In the peak season, 13 different types of beer are brewed here. The use of ingredients is enormous. The Mönchengladbach site uses 35,000 tons of malt alone. Malt, also known as barley malt, is produced artificially. The barley corn is soaked in water and then allowed to germinate for a few days before being dried. Malt production takes place in special malting plants, which then supply the brewing industry. This brewery alone requires 1,400 deliveries of malt every year. While the barley is being delivered, brewer and maltster Sebastian Fassen checks its quality.
I just make sure there are no foreign bodies in there, other grain types, especially things like maize, as we're GMO-free. That's what I'm looking for. Larger bits of metal, perhaps. Just an initial optical impression.
Before brewing, the malt first has to be milled in a process known as crushing. The crushed malt is then automatically pumped into the brew house, where the actual brewing process begins. In the so-called mash tun, the malt is mixed with hot water.
This is the mash, grist mixed with water. Here the enzymes from the malt convert the starch into sugar. And it's this sugar that we need for alcoholic fermentation.
18 tons of barley malt and 500 hectoliters of water are needed to make a brewing mash. The mashing process takes around 2.5 hours, because that's how long the enzymes need to convert the starch into sugar. This brew here will later produce 200 hectoliters of beer. That's 40,000 half-liter bottles. All the beer's ingredients come together in the brew house, in strict accordance with Germany's purity law. Besides the malt, there's water, hops, and yeast. At the control panel, Sven Willem monitors every step.
We can see here that there's a Pils mash in one container, and that'll be made into a Pils beer. It's mash number 1612. That's how many we've made so far this year. We can see that there's 700 hectoliter in this container, and it shows the current temperature of 72 degrees. It's very important for your process to keep the temperatures very accurately, because the enzymes in there need an optimum temperature, and if that's not maintained, the starch can't be degraded to sugar properly.
After 2.5 hours in the mash tun, the mash is transferred to one of 2 Lauter tuns, each of which holds 680 hectoliters. The so-called lautering process now takes just under 3 hours.
This is where the finished mash is pumped in and where the solids and the liquid are separated. We don't need the solids from the grist anymore. So that's why the lauter tun has a sieve bottom that the liquid can pass through. That's how we get the clear wort. What's left is the spent grain, a byproduct that we can sell to the cattle industry because it's a very well-controlled waste product and high-quality animal feed.
The next stop is the brew kettle. This is where the hops are added. Then the wort has to boil for about an hour and a half. After boiling, the plant cools the wort down before adding the yeast. The yeast is what starts the alcoholic fermentation that takes place in gigantic fermentation tanks. There are 26 of these tanks with a total volume of 76,000 hectoliters in Mönchengladbach. The largest can hold 5,000 hectoliters. Pils, for instance, stays in the tank for 6 days. This produces alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. Because heat is bad for fermentation, the tanks are cooled down to 16 degrees Celsius. The staff in the control center monitor every production.
This is the brain behind the production. We monitor and plan the entire process from here. The staff are all trained brewers and maltsters and can intervene if there are any problems to make sure the process runs optimally.
After fermentation, all beer types, apart from wheat beer, are filtered to remove any remaining particles that may cloud the beer. This filter system is new and differs significantly from its predecessor. The old filter system produced 1,000 tons of residue every year. This trub, as it's called, is classified as hazardous waste in some federal states and has to be disposed of at great expense. The new system can process 7,000 hectoliters per hour without producing any hazardous waste. It runs 24 hours a day and filters the beer through the finest membranes. If they get clogged, a cleaning solution provides the remedy. And to prevent production downtimes, the plant has 2 such filter units. The beer is now finished and ready for bottling. It's kept in the storage cellar in 40 gigantic tanks. Each one is 15 meters deep, 3.6 meters high, and holds 1,400 hectoliters.
In these tanks, the finished filtered beer is stored until it's bottled. To be able to fill and empty these tanks, we need a relatively large number of hoses because this area hasn't been automated yet.
Up to 13 different beer types are stored here at 2 to 4 degrees. Before being bottled, they have to prove their quality one last time.
I'm just taking a sample for tasting from this tank because we carry out lots of quality controls, including microbiological and chemical technical ones. But we still have to make sure that aroma and flavor are perfect too. That's why I take this sample here, check the aroma, and of course the flavor.
Excellent. From these tanks, the beer is then pumped to the bottling plants. In Mönchengladbach, there are 3 bottling lines altogether, 2 for glass bottles and another one for cans. Altogether, they can fill 178,000 units per hour. But in order to do the filling, the plant needs empty bottles. So forklifts constantly supply the line with empties. 12 employees work here in shifts. The first stage is cleaning all the old deposit bottles. First, the bottles are removed from the crates fully automatically. Then, both are put through separate cleaning processes. A deposit bottle can be reused up to 50 times, so used beer bottles cover up to 95% of the demand. The remaining 5% is made up of new bottles added each year. The glass lines can handle bottles of different sizes, though only one size can be processed at a time. Before beer can be filled into the cleaned bottles, the so-called bottle inspector checks the quality of each individual unit. The computer checks 3 parameters, and should even the slightest deviation be detected, the bottle is immediately ejected. The core of the plant is the beer bottling process. With its 130 filler units, this line can fill 46,000 bottles an hour. To guarantee the beer a long shelf life, one undesirable element has to be removed: oxygen.
Directly before corking, we have a very fine water jet that very briefly froths up the top part of the bottle to get the remaining oxygen out. Then the cork's put on, the bottle is filled and finished.
The line fills and corks 766 bottles per minute. After corking, the bottles are rinsed to clean off the beer foam. After labeling, the bottles are loaded into the cleaned crates fully automatically. 2,300 crates of beer leave the plant every hour. That's almost 40 crates a minute. To prevent congestion, the logistics have to work perfectly. There are 8 forklift drivers to make sure that's the case. The crates are stacked on the pallets automatically, as that's the only way to transport such enormous quantities in the short time available. The forklift can take a maximum of 4 pallets at a time. That's 160 crates of beer. The brewery has 28 trucks, all ready to deliver the beer from Mönchengladbach to the retail outlets.
We have a storage area here of about 12,000 square meters. The trucks are loaded and unloaded from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, and we have about 150 of them a day.
The brewing giant needs vast quantities of raw materials, for example, hops. And Germany's most important hop-growing region is Hallertau in Bavaria. Hops, green gold. Without the flowers of these majestic vine plants, brewing beer would be impossible. Bavaria's Hallertau region is home to the largest continuous hop-growing area in the world. The hops are in full bloom. The flowers of the female plants needed for brewing beer are called cones. From the end of August to mid-September, it's harvest time in Hallertau. In Vorburg on the Danube, Martin Schmeitzel grows 8 different hop varieties on his 37-hectare plantation. He's a real expert and stands for the highest quality. Today, the hop farmer is receiving a visit from Markus Hoppe, a young craft beer brewer who only brews his beer by hand and in small quantities.
So. Servus, grüß dich.
How are you?
Good, and you?
Do you want to see the hops?
I do.
Right, come on then.
Today, Markus Hoppe is looking at a very specific hop variety called Mandarina Bavaria. In the past, hops were only used as a preservative. It provides the bitter flavor and boosts foam formation. Since the 1980s, the craft beer movement in the USA, which is all about handmade beer, has shown that you can get much more out of hops. There are 2 types of hops. Besides bitter hops that only reveal their flavor on the palate, there are various aroma hops, which develop their aromatic appeal in the nose, rather than the mouth.
How long do they need?
A good 10 days, I reckon. The aroma will get better. It doesn't smell of mandarin yet. Just before they ripe, they still smell like green tomatoes. And over the next week or 2, it'll ripen and get its mandarin flavor.
In this hop garden, we have Mandarina Bavaria. It's one of the new cultivated varieties, and it brings along this mandarin aroma, which explains the name. I don't think it's pure mandarin, but rather citrus fruit. The aroma you get when you rub the peel of different citrus fruits, that aroma. And that's the flavor it has.
Polaris, Mandarina Bavaria, Hercules, Ariana. The list of new hop varieties is long.
I define my beers by the hops, and it's really very important for my customers, different customers than the classical beer drinkers, who attach great importance to the fact that on my labels they can read which hop variety is in the beer. And so I've said I'm going to go one step further and say which grower the hops are from and from which region.
One field further away, the hop harvest is in full swing. Only the female hop plants are harvested because only they produce the cones which are used in brewing beer. The plants grow to a height of 7 meters along thin wires. These wires are harvested as well and later returned to the fields in compost, along with other plant residues. After a year, they have completely rotted away. Once the hops are ripe, they are cut off at the bottom by a special harvesting device. A conveyor chain which runs at the same speed as the tractor guides the hops to the rear. The plant is then pulled free at the top and falls backwards onto the trailer. The harvest period for hops goes from the end of August to the middle of September, depending on the variety. Later, the cones are separated from the rest of the plant, dried, and subsequently crushed. They are then pressed into pellets or used to make yeast extract. Cones that haven't been crushed are very rarely used for brewing beer. Hop grower Martin Schmeitzel wants to show the young brewer his best cones, and they mainly grow where they can get the most sunlight, right at the top. And that's where you can see the hop flowers in all their splendor. Hops are a perennial plant, so each year a new plant sprouts from the rootstock. The entire field has steel cables spanned across it. A hop grower needs 13 tons of special hop wire for his fields every year. And the hops, a climbing plant which belongs to the cannabis family, grows upwards along these wires.
Look, Marcus, those are the cables we hang the wires on in the winter. We drive through there in the winter, 3 men on the platform, and we tie them on.
For every vine.
You can see them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We could carry on counting. 1 wire for every vine. At the bottom, there's a 1.1 millimeter wire and a cord at the top. That's because it's much stronger than the wire and because the vine stands in the wind all day. The plastic cord is stronger than the wire, and so it's much more stable in the wind. Because we're on higher ground here, there's always a lot of wind, much more than in central Hallertau.
On his 37 hectares, hop farmer Martin Schmeitzel grows around 155,000 hop vines. In winter, it takes 4 workers almost a month just to hang up the new wires for the plants. In spring, the 3 strongest shoots of each vine have to be wound around the wire clockwise by hand. Up to now, it's been rather unusual for brewers to visit hop growers. But for Markus Hoppe, it's a logical step. He's more than willing to accept the additional work and the costs that go with it.
The product is my top priority. I stand for quality. So if something goes wrong, unfortunately a fermentation error recently meant I had to destroy quite a large amount of beer. It was drinkable, but it wasn't quite the same as it normally is. And my beer's not cheap, so I just couldn't sell it because if I did, at my current size, it would put me out of business.
Just how the hops are processed and how Markus Hoppe brews his beer with them, we'll see later. For now, we'll devote ourselves to the other ingredients. The Technical University of Munich's Chair for Brewing and Beverage Technology is located in Weihenstephan, 40 kilometers from the Bavarian capital. In the direct vicinity of the world's oldest brewery still operating today, research is being carried out on the beer ingredients malt, hops, and yeast, as well as the latest brewing technologies. Focus here is on the primary ingredient of beer, malt. But malt, as such, doesn't exist. It's made artificially by adding water to barley and heating it up to make it germinate. What happens inside the barley corn plays the central role in the beer brewing process.
Important for brewing beer is the endosperm of the corn. That's this white area here inside the grain, which contains the starch and the protein. In the brewing house, during the mashing process, this starch is later turned into sugar, which is then converted to alcohol by the yeast.
For malt production, only 2-line spring barley is used. Although the most important ingredient in beer has been known for centuries, researchers are constantly trying to optimize it.
The current focus of barley research is being placed on the major issue of bacterial resistance. Yields play a very important role, so do the constituents with regard to protein and starch. But gluten is, of course, a huge topic. Gluten-free beer is a major goal that can be achieved through breeding.
Barley is made into malt in the so-called malting process. This produces roots and leaf germ buds and leads to enzymes forming in the corn which are necessary for brewing beer. In Weihenstephan, there are special germination drums for this. 200 kilos of barley are mixed with at least 50 liters of water. The subsequent germination process takes 6 days. After germination, the barley must be dried. In this process, the duration and temperature determine the color and aroma of the malt.
Malt. We always say that the body of the beer is very important. It's responsible for the original gravity, that's the resulting sugar content, and of course for the color. The color is determined by the different malt varieties. Here we have normal Pilsner malt, kilned very gently and mainly used for Pilsner beers, or the classical light-colored lagers that we know. If you want a darker beer, you need to use the various dark malts. You can tell from the color, it's more intensive and produces a different flavor. And finally, we have the so-called roasted malt, which is roasted at very high temperatures of 180 to 200 degrees Celsius, similar to coffee beans. That's used for black beer or for stout, porter beers, etc. What's very important here in Bavaria, of course, is wheat malt. This can be made in a similar way to barley malt, and this here is one of the lighter wheat malt types, and this has to make up at least 50% of the mash for wheat beer.
Back in Hallertau at Martin Schmeitzel's hop farm. The harvest is well underway and the hop vines are being brought into the picking barn on the trailers. The trailers themselves are equipped with a special conveyor system to set the plants down as gently as possible. 8 seasonal staff work in the barn to strip the green gold, the cones, from the female hop vines. Martin Schmeitzel's hop picking machine is a rarity. He had it built in the Czech Republic, and since then has extended and completely reworked it. First, one end of the plant is hung into a conveyor chain, just like in a conventional hop picking machine. But now it gets interesting. In contrast to classical picking machines in which the plants are processed lying on the conveyor belts, this self-designed machine harvests the hops while the vines are in a hanging position. Here we can see the Hercules variety being harvested. It's one of 8 varieties that Martin Schmeitzel grows on his 37 hectares. The conveyor chain transports the hanging hop plants, which belong to the same family as cannabis plants, into the machine interior, where thousands of small picking hooks strip the cones from the vines. This process is particularly gentle on the cones. 1,500 vines pass through the picking machine every hour. At harvest time, the machine runs 12 hours a day. Growing hops is hard work. Nevertheless, there are still 1,200 farms in the region earning a living from hop growing. The hops come out of the machine at the side on the so-called pre-selector belt, which runs against the direction of the falling cones. It picks up stalk and leaf residues, leaving only individual cones, and they are taken on another conveyor belt to the next station.
Yes, let's go.
The picking machine is currently processing the Hercules variety. The name says it all. It's characterized by high yields and a high level of active ingredients. One floor up is where the freshly picked cones arrive next.
This is really the best place.
That's right. You can see everything here.
So you'll be able to brew a bit more beer now.
Before the hops are dried in the kiln, which is the next step, brewer Marcus Hoppe has another chance to touch and, above all, smell the freshly harvested cones. Brewers need a good nose in order to determine the quality and the flavor.
I think it smells a bit like maracuja or something.
The finished cones await further processing on the first floor. The rest of the hop plants can't be used for brewing beer and are chopped up. The plant remains are blown outside through several giant pipes. The huge green heaps behind Martin Schmeitzel's picking barn at harvest time can be up to 10 meters high. By the end, there will be some 1,500 cubic meters. The hop wires are also cut up among the plant residues, and just like all the rest, they are put back on the hop fields as natural fertilizer. The quantity of hops the farmer grows on his 37 hectares is enough to make so much beer that he could supply the Munich Oktoberfest 38 times over. The cones are now dried in the kiln. For 3.5 hours, they are turned over and over constantly in hot air at a temperature of 65 degrees Celsius. These hot air kilns were invented in Hallertau. When the moisture content is at about 10%, the green gold is ready. Beneath this giant mixing belt is the conditioning container and the packaging station. After cooling down for 5 hours, the cones are then transported to the baler on a conveyor belt. Tasks that used to be done by hand are now taken on by this press. After pressing, the rectangular bales are then sewn together. Up to 1,500 of these bales are stored on Martin's farm at harvest time. The weight and moisture content of every single bale is recorded. Each one weighs between 62 and 67 kilos. Measuring the moisture content is not actually necessary, but hop farmer Martin does it anyway. He wants any product leaving his farm to be 100% perfect. The bales are rectangular for a very simple reason. It's the ideal shape for stacking, and that allows optimal utilization of the available storage space. The young brewer Markus Hoppe would now like to find out which of Martin's hop varieties is the most suitable for his special kind of beer. This careful testing of the cones is known as evaluation.
It's important to rub it together properly so that it breaks up and gets a bit warm. Shall we change over?
What's your favorite then?
From those?
Yeah, those 4. Depending on the situation, it's all a bit different.
Well, it depends on what kind of beer I want to make with them. That one, or... For me, the one on the left, no question.
On the left, yeah? I already had one customer who picked this here. He wanted this one for his beer.
I think that one's really good. Right.
Flowery. Yeah, that's how I'd describe it too.
Yeah, not too fruity, but not too grassy either.
The young brewer would like to evaluate a few more hop types. The next one is complicated. Polaris, a hop variety for absolute professionals. The aroma is unique and presents a real challenge for brewing.
That's brutal. Polaris, it's perverse. It's really golden yellow.
You won't get a good evaluation because it's not a nice color. It's got so many constituents and so much oil, it just changes color.
It smells like spearmint candy. I've never tasted a beer that I was 100% convinced of that was brewed with Polaris.
I haven't got a lot of that.
A really difficult hop.
Have you tried?
No, I haven't yet, but I think it's definitely about time I tried.
And to finish off with, there's something quite special. A glass of beer with fresh hop cones. The flavor changes immediately.
So much better than when you're evaluating. Now, let's see if we can make your beer a bit better.
Wonderful.
Now we both need a beer. Jakob, have you got one?
Ah, good one too, thanks. Oh, let's see. This is Hercules, right? Cheers.
Beer experts, undisturbed.
It does taste different.
Later, Markus Hoppe will show us how he used Martin Schmeitz's hops for a new beer creation. But first, let's go back to Weihenstephan. Yeast research is also done here. Yeast is what converts the sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide in the mash. Brewers use 2 different types of yeast, bottom fermenting and top fermenting. These 2 types mainly differ in flavor. Top fermenting yeast creates fruity aromas, while the bottom fermenting varieties produce the typical Pils or lager aroma. The difference can be seen best under a microscope. Bottom fermenting yeast is made up of separate cells and is used for brewing pills and pale beers. The top fermenting varieties form chains of budded cells, which are used for wheat beer and Germany's Alt and Kölsch.
Very good. Here we can see the cell chains in the top fermenting yeast and the bubbles latching onto them. That's wonderful yeast. I think this beer will be good. There are a great many yeast strains which are not used in making beer, but for instance in wine production, and they produce very different aroma profiles. We're experimenting quite a lot here at the moment using wine yeast, for example, for the fermentation of beer wort, so people might ultimately get certain wine aromas in their beer.
The researchers at the Faculty of Brewing and Beverage Technology at the Technical University of Munich are also examining how flavor is experienced in beer consumption. In their in-house sensory laboratory, they're looking into the question of where does which beer taste best. After all, external influences like light, temperature, and pressure influence the desire for certain foods. For example, tomato juice is a particularly popular drink on planes. In special tasting chambers, faculty staff and students try various types of beer, and while doing so, the light changes. Their impressions of flavor are then entered directly into the computer, and that's only the beginning. In the future, the Weihenstephan team aim to do a lot more research on the subject of tasting beer.
All kinds of external influences have a direct effect on the flavor. We're playing a little with the color. Then the whole thing is going to be supplemented with different sounds and aroma substances. The temperature is going to be adjusted. All this plays a significant role when it comes to our perception and evaluation of food.
Back to craft beer brewer Markus Hoppe. And as you would expect, genuine craftsmanship is the name of the game. Today, along with his assistant Shandi, he wants to brew a new type of beer. The hops come from hop farmer Martin Schmeitzel. But before they go into the beer, he first has to crush the malt.
So, let's just see how it's come out. What do you think, Sandy, okay? Great, looks really good. We're brewing on a small scale now, just to give our creativity a free rein. We try new beer types, and what's always fascinated me about brewing is the technical procedure on the one hand, but primarily the beer variety. And when you've got something like this, you can try a lot of things out. You don't just go to a huge plant and say, I've got an idea for a recipe, let's make 6,000 liters of this. Oh dear, it tastes awful, throw it away. That costs a lot of money, but if we brew like this, we can try out anything.
Markus Hoppe is brewing 40 liters today. For this, he'll need 8 kilos of crushed malt, mashed with 20 liters of water. By heating it slowly, the starch in the malt corn turns into sugar.
Where does this go?
Just tip it in.
This malt sugar is needed for alcoholic fermentation. Markus Hoppe is what Germans call a wandering brewer. He hires breweries to brew his established beer varieties, as he doesn't own his own facilities. For small brews like this, he uses his own little pilot brewery. But even here, every single step must be correct.
Okay, it's too cold. Can you just keep stirring it? It's really important that we don't raise the temperature too much, because once the enzyme goes above this temperature, if it gets too hot, it's inactive, destroyed, and then it won't work anymore. That's why we have to make sure we never go above that, but heat it up slowly at about 1 degree per minute. Then we let it rest. That means the enzyme has a certain time to work, and then we start heating again until the next rest, so that another enzyme can work. It all goes hand in hand.
Today, the young brewer would like to make a strongly hopped beer. He maintained the last sugar rest at 62 degrees for a very long time. The mash is now filled into the lauter tun. A sieve at the bottom of the tun separates the solids from the liquid, because it's only the liquid, the so-called wort, that's used later for the beer. Sieving in the lauter tun works best when the mixture is almost 80 degrees, as the mash is at its most liquid at this temperature. To make sure the wort is completely clear, Markus taps it off and pours it back in again.
So now there are no more solids in there, that's just natural cloudiness. And when the spent grain settles, it forms a natural filter layer, and then it turns a bit glossy all by itself.
Do you work by litres or time?
Here I work by what I see, what it looks like.
The next step is boiling the wort. At 100 degrees, all bacteria are killed off. The beer the young brewer is testing today will be hopped twice. The first hops are always added during wort boiling. The solids left over from lautering, known as spent grain, have no further use. Assistant Shandy can now dispose of them. To enable him to brew the beer again later in a large brewery, Markus Hoppe meticulously notes down all the quantities used and the time taken for each step.
So now it's 12:55 and we've been boiling for 60 minutes. So we can put the first hops in. Give me the bitter hops. Very good.
So. Wunderbar. So.
Hey, come here and see how good the hops smell already. Got a really green blanket on the top.
Super.
Today we're brewing a pale ale that's very strongly hopped, and we're using two hop types from Martin, Hercules and Mandarina. We've got an event in Innsbruck now where we're presenting two of my beers, as well as this one, filtered and unfiltered, and we're letting the people decide which one they like better.
After an hour's boiling time, the wort is ready. Stirring it up rapidly collects all the hop residues and substances that cloud the beer in the middle. They're no longer needed and form a lump known as trub cone. When the beer is tapped off later, this remains in the container. The wort is now cooled down to 20 degrees Celsius with a heat exchanger, because the yeast can only be added at this temperature.
19.6, wonderful. So now we can add the yeast.
Right.
First, Markus Hoppe fills the cooled wort into the fermenting tank, where it will be mixed with the yeast, so fermentation can begin. As temperatures are now no longer very high, bacteria could turn the beer sour, so everything has to be completely sterile.
Hygiene is everything now. When we're working in the hot area and we make a mistake, it's not too bad, because everything's boiled. But in the whole fermentation area, everything's been treated with disinfectant beforehand and cleaned with alkaline detergent. It's got to be spotless, because if anything's in there, the beer goes sour right away and you can't drink it.
Another dose of disinfectant, and the stopper can be screwed on. This allows the fermentation gases to escape, and it protects the beer from unwelcome intruders, such as oxygen and insects. The beer now takes 6 weeks to develop its alcohol content and its full flavor, and then it's tasting time. The Hop Research Center Höll is located in Hallertau, and the goal of the researchers is to find new hop varieties. In the center's 5-hectare breeding garden, 4,000 seedlings from crossbreeding are planted every year. They are the only survivors from a merciless selection process. Hop breeder Anton Lutz only selects the very best to be harvested for further experiments.
We only harvest robust, healthy seedlings, which we believe to have the potential to be marketed later as a variety of their own.
Before the harvest, the hop breeder carefully notes the smallest details.
I determine the harvest time. That's done by feeling the cones, smelling the aroma, and then you can more or less decide when the optimum ripening time has been reached. I then mark them with a colored band, so my workers know when to harvest the vine. And finally, I make notes on their most important agronomic characteristics. For example, things like plant shape, is it cylindrical, top-heavy, or how many cones are on the vines, how big the cones are, and finally, whether there's any infestation with diseases or pests.
In the breeding garden, there are other hop varieties besides the center's own breeds. If they are infested with pests, the vines in the breeding garden will be as well. But that's completely intentional. This Czech hop variety lacks the resistances which are already bred into all Höll strains.
This plant is totally infested with real mildew. This ultimately leads to a strong browning of the cones and they die prematurely. This seriously impairs the quality, particularly because the aroma suffers. The cones smell moldy, and you can taste that right through to the beer. In our breeding program, resistance to mildew is the top priority. All the seedlings we plant are fully mildew resistant, so this disease can no longer occur.
250,000 seedlings, and only one comes through as a new hop variety. Any weakness in the breeding garden is ruthlessly rooted out.
Here you can see a very weak vine, which only produces a very low yield. It hasn't even managed to reach the trellis and is also susceptible to disease, so it definitely won't be marked for harvesting.
The fruits of the up to 7-meter high female plant are called cones, and only they are used for brewing beer. Inside the cones is lupulin. It contains the alpha acid and essential oils. There are high-alpha hops used early in the brewing process and aroma hops, which contain less alpha acid but a lot of oil.
The cones should ideally be of a nice, even size and relatively robust, so they can be cleaned easily in the machine. It's not good when they're still interspersed with leaves, because then they don't roll when they're in the picking or cleaning machines and end up outside with the waste.
The plants selected by Anton Lutz are processed here. In the field, selection is based on external characteristics: size, yield, amount of cones on the vine, and resistance to diseases. Now it's all about the cone's inner qualities. These extensive tests begin in the picking barn. To prevent the samples getting mixed up, only one genotype is processed by the machine at any one time. The cones are packed in sacks of different sizes. After drying, the small ones go straight into the lab. The large ones are used for brewing small amounts of beer. Without these brewing tests, the hops can't be evaluated properly, because ultimately it's all about flavor. The data has to be recorded meticulously to be sure which cones come from which plants. One floor higher, the cones are dried in the kiln. The hop varieties bred at the Yeast Research Center are so successful that they make up 90% of all the plants on Germany's hop growing land today. And Yeast has been developing new hop strains for the world's markets for 90 years.
Brewers from all over the world come to us and, together with me, pick out individual strains they're interested in, take them home, carry out test brews according to their own taste, and report the results to us. This is very important for us in developing new hop varieties, because it doesn't necessarily follow that the aroma they smell in the hops will actually be present in the beer.
In recent years, demand for new varieties of hops has skyrocketed. The craft brewing trend and their hop-based beer is constantly driving demand for varieties of aroma hops.
Brewing tests are especially important for aroma hop strains because they are only added very late in the brewing process and are the main influence on the beer's flavor and aroma.
The dried and vacuumed hop samples are now taken to the Institute's own laboratory. Anton Lutz's main concern now is the alpha acid and the essential oils.
Hello, Klaus, how are you? Here are the latest samples from the garden.
The concentrations of the cone's constituents rise rapidly during the harvest period and are constantly measured.
I've got the latest results for the new Callista breed. They're very good, especially in the upper range for what this variety will bring in on average over the years. It shows that this year's crop is a very good one. We can expect oil content to be relatively high and consequently the brewing values for the brewers as well.
Activities are not solely focused on research and development. So that the varieties developed here can unfold their full potential, the center also offers practical support to the hop farmers.
Between mid-August and the end of September, we carry out test harvests and determine the alpha acid content, and this enables us to give the farmers the optimum harvest time for each variety relatively reliably.
But above all, it's the demand for aroma hop varieties that's really grown in recent years. It's not the alpha value that's important, but rather the flavor and aroma of the cones. For the development of these varieties, the creativity of breeders is the really decisive element.
The high alpha varieties have to be especially efficient because the yield, alpha acid content, and consequently the price per kilo of alpha are crucial factors for the growers. The most efficient plant variety will succeed on the world market. For the aroma varieties, the crucial factor is the aroma impression they make in the beer. This is, of course, a very exciting time for a breeder. Until recently, hop breeding was, let's say, relatively boring. It was all about higher yield, higher alpha acid content, higher prices for the plants, but now it's all about aroma and variety. So both the brewers and the breeders can just do their own thing.
Two new breeds have recently been launched onto the market, Callista and Ariana, and Anton Lutz has a clear favorite.
Callista adds a fruitier flavor, and these beers are characterized by outstanding drinkability. That's the unconditional desire for the next drink of beer.
The Tribaun Craft Beer Bar is located in Innsbruck. Here, Markus Hoppe from Hoppebräu will be serving his 3 beers today. This kind of event carries the name Tap Takeover, and in the craft beer scene is extremely popular. The very knowledgeable clientele is going to decide which beer tastes best, filtered or unfiltered. For this, Markus Hoppe has filtered one half of the beer from his pilot brewery. The other half is put on tap, unfiltered. There are 20 liters of each, and whichever is empty first is the winner.
Some like filtered beers that go down well. Others prefer a bitter, strong, intensive taste in their mouths. I think it'll be a 50-50 result. Because some like it smooth and tasty and drink a bit more, and others want it strong and intense.
Let the tasting begin. Markus Hoppe is a staunch advocate of filtered beer. Let's see if the Innsbruckers agree with him.
Here you are, Yoshi. Which one first?
I don't know which is which. What's that?
Wildsau, filtered, unfiltered. Fuchsteufelswild, unfiltered. Fuchsteufelswild, filtered. Start with that one. The filtered one first. I'll start with the unfiltered one. In such a young and fresh segment like the craft brewing scene, customer contact is extremely important. We open the doors and say, hey, come in, people. We'll tell you what's in the product and how it's made. And that way you create trust. And with this trust, the novelty of the products, a lot of very interested and open-minded people can quickly become very loyal customers. And your own enthusiasm for the product can quickly be passed on to them.
With craft beers, that's extremely important, because so much craftsmanship and love for the product is reflected in the price, of course. At the end of the tasting, it's the unfiltered beer that's most popular. It was extremely close, but nevertheless for Markus Hoppe, the evening was a huge success.
It was really exciting to hear the feedback from the people. We had a lot of fun, and I'm going to stick to my philosophy and approach, because beer should be beer and has to be drinkable. I really enjoyed myself.
Beer, a drink that has been quenching thirst for centuries, but which is, even today, constantly being reinvented.